In the swamps of Louisiana, entire families began vanishing without a trace. Wagons abandoned, horses left wandering, but not a single body ever found. What investigators uncovered wasn't a legend or ghost story, but a real family who turned survival into industry and neighbors into meat. Stay with me and subscribe now, because this is America's forgotten horror. Got to understand how the Broussard family operated for so long without interference. You have to first imagine the world they inhabited. In the early 1900s, Louisiana was still a patchwork of swamps, bayous, and scattered parishes. Roads were little more than mud paths, swallowed each spring by floodwater, and nearly impassable once the rains returned. Entire families could vanish into the wetlands and never be heard from again, not because of crime, but because that land itself was unforgiving, isolating, and dangerous. The Broussard homestead sat deep in this wilderness, miles from the nearest village and hidden behind thick cypress groves that seemed to lean together like watchmen keeping out the curious. The main house was a sagging wooden structure with a rust-streaked tin roof, its walls patched with mismatched planks from decades of repairs. Around it sprawled smaller cabins, sheds, and makeshift pens, each added by different hands and in different years. To an outsider, it might look like a poor farmer's land barely holding itself together. But those who ventured close enough felt something else, an unnatural quiet that clung to the air. 14 family members lived there, bound by bloodlines that had tangled themselves into knots over generations. Outsiders spoke of them as if they were one body with many faces, always moving together, always silent, each one knowing their role without needing a word. The family matriarch, Eulalie Broussard, 75 years old, ruled with an authority that no one questioned. Bent with age, but sharp-eyed and severe, she was said to communicate with just a glance, a raised finger, or a subtle shake of her head. Beside her stood Augustin, her 42-year-old son, and the family's figurehead. Tall, gaunt, and scarred from years of hard labor, Augustin was known for speaking only when necessary, and when he did, his gravelly voice carried the weight of command. Where Eulalie was the brain, Augustin was the fist. But it was Corinne, Eulalie's daughter, who kept the machinery of daily life in order. 38 years old and coldly efficient, Corinne assigned chores, supervised meals, and disciplined children with a terrifying calm. Her presence was said to silence even the youngest members of the family. Around them were cousins Baptiste, broad-shouldered and intimidating, and Sabine, devoutly loyal and fanatical in her obedience. Younger adults like Lisette and Remy filled out the ranks, appearing in town from time to barter or buy goods. And then there were the children, 7 of them, ranging from teenagers to barely 6 years old. They rarely spoke to strangers, and when they did, it was often in an archaic French dialect that few outside the family understood. In town, they moved in strict formation, eyes cast downward, gestures rehearsed as if they were drilled soldiers rather than children. What truly unsettled the locals wasn't just their silence, it was their discipline. No child strayed. No one laughed or played. They carried themselves as if every step, every motion, was part of an invisible code. Yet despite their isolation, the Broussards were never destitute. Beginning around 1902, neighbors noticed subtle changes. Their clothing grew sturdier, their tools newer, their livestock fatter. When they visited the market, they often brought slabs of salted meat, neatly cut and wrapped in cloth. They always claimed it was game from the swamp's wild boar, deer, or smaller animals hunted in the reeds. But those who bought from them remarked that the cuts seemed too uniform, too carefully butchered. The meat was lighter than venison, softer than pork, and carried a faint odor that was difficult to place, an odor that lingered even through heavy salting. The children, especially, unsettled the butchers. They hovered near the counters, noses drawn close to the drying racks, inhaling with slow, deliberate breaths as though evaluating the quality. And each time they left with an expression that was not curiosity, but disappointment, as though what was offered did not compare to something they already knew. This was the world of the Broussards, hidden, disciplined, secretive, and growing quietly prosperous, while families around them struggled. Their isolation shielded them. Their silence protected them. And their reputation as strange but harmless swamp dwellers kept outsiders at bay. No one yet realized that their prosperity was not born of clever hunting or thrift, but of something far more horrifying. By the spring of 1902, whispers began to spread along the muddy parish roads. At first, they were little more than unsettling coincidences. A family traveling west failed to arrive at their destination. Another vanished on their way to a sawmill job farther inland. Most locals chalked it up to the dangers of the swamp crocodiles, quicksand, fever, or bandits who preyed on the vulnerable. But soon the coincidences became too regular to dismiss. The first family lost was the Delaunay's. Their wagon was discovered in a clearing, belongings untouched, pots, clothes, even coins scattered in a small purse. The horses were found nearby, jittery and wild-eyed, as though they'd been spooked by something they could not escape. There was no blood, no footprints, and no signs of a struggle. It was as if the family had simply walked off the road and dissolved into the swamp. Then it happened again. And again. By autumn, nearly a dozen families had disappeared in almost identical fashion. Always the same pattern. Wagons intact, possessions left behind, horses cut loose but alive. And always in the same region, within a few miles of the Broussard homestead. People began avoiding that stretch of road. Merchants started traveling in groups, preferring long detours rather than risk passing through alone. Mothers told their children frightening stories about voices in the swamp calling travelers from the road, luring them into the reeds. Fear clung to the region like morning fog. But one man could not ignore what was happening. Father Thomas Brough, the parish priest who ministered to scattered families across the countryside. Concerned by the disappearances, he tried to visit the Broussard homestead several times. Each attempt ended the same way. Augustin Broussard meeting him at the edge of the property, arms crossed, voice low and firm. Polite but immovable. "We have no need of sermons here, Father," he would say. Behind him, in the shadows of the cabins, the priest caught glimpses of movement figures watching from a distance. Silent as trees. Sheriff Harlan Gaspard also began to suspect a pattern. A meticulous man with 20 years of experience, he kept careful notes of each disappearance. What struck him was the timing. Every time a family vanished, the Broussard property fell into an unnatural stillness for 2 or 3 days. No smoke rose from their chimneys. No figures were seen in the fields. Even the usual trips to town for salt or supplies stopped. And then just as suddenly, life returned. Smoke rose again. Figures moved about the property, and soon after, members of the family appeared at the local market, always with barrels or sacks of salted meat, wrapped neatly in cloth. They claimed it was swamp game, harvested in abundance. But the amount they brought seemed impossible for a single family, especially one with no large herds of livestock. The town butcher, who had grown up in the region and handled every kind of meat imaginable, noticed something even stranger. The cuts the Broussards brought were unnervingly precise, unlike the rough butchering common to rural hunters. The flesh was pale, softer than venison, and carried a smell he couldn't quite identify. A smell that turned his stomach in a way he couldn't explain. And then there were the children. Each time they came to town, they moved with military discipline, never breaking formation, never straying from the adults. They showed no interest in toys or sweets, only in the butcher's counter. They leaned close, inhaling the scent of pork or venison with long, measured breaths. And when they pulled back, their faces always seemed disappointed, as though comparing it to something better. Something they knew too well. By 1903, fear in the community had hardened into certainty. Families no longer traveled alone, and rumors spread in hushed tones at taverns and markets. The Broussards were not merely eccentric. They were connected somehow, some way to the disappearances, but still, no one could prove it. And without proof, the sheriff's hands were tied. The Broussards carried on as they always had, their silence protecting them, their discipline concealing them, while more families disappeared into the swamp without a trace. By the summer of 1905, the weight of unanswered disappearances pressed heavily on the community. Entire households had vanished without explanation, and even hardened men who worked the timber camps refused to travel alone. Rumors swirled, but none were more unsettled than Father Thomas Brough, who could not shake the memory of shadows moving silently behind the Broussard cabins. One August afternoon, after weeks of heavy rain, the priest took a familiar trail that skirted the Broussard property. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to skin like a damp shroud. But beneath the scent of wet earth and swamp lily was something else, an odor both sweet and putrid, a cloying smell that made his stomach turn. He followed it deeper into the trees, his boots sinking into the softened soil. The rain had eroded part of the embankment, exposing what lay beneath. At first, Father Brough thought he saw nothing more than rags tangled in roots. But as he leaned closer, he realized these were not discarded scraps. They were pieces of clothing. Torn hems of dresses, the sleeve of a man's shirt. A child's stocking still stretched inside a tiny shoe. His heart raced as he brushed aside the mud. Buttons glinted through the muck. A simple brooch. A child's ribbon. And then, half buried in the wet soil, a tooth human, unmistakable. With trembling hands, he uncovered more. Belt buckles, a rusted pocket knife, fragments of jewelry. It was a burial ground, not of a single person, but of many. And none of it lay deep. It was as though the swamp itself was trying to give back what had been hidden. That night, Father Brough could barely hold his pen steady as he recorded his discovery. In his diary, he wrote, "I fear I have found evidence of a terrible crime. The belongings of families lie in the soil, and I can no longer deny what my heart has whispered. The Broussards prosper while others vanish. May God forgive me, but I believe the two are bound together." The next morning, the priest carried a leather satchel to Sheriff Harlan Gaspard, filled with the artifacts he had collected: buttons, scraps of fabric, the child's shoe. Gaspard examined them in silence, his weathered hands tracing the edges of each object. He had seen robberies, murders, and the aftermath of drunken brawls, but never anything like this. To be certain, he called upon Dr. Emile Renaud, the parish physician who doubled as coroner. Under lamplight, Dr. Renaud sifted through the items. His verdict was grim. These were not trinkets lost by travelers. They were torn violently, stripped from bodies in haste. And the tooth? It showed signs of being yanked free, rather than naturally lost. The sheriff pulled out his map of the parish, marked with notes from each disappearance. With Father Brough watching, he placed pins where abandoned wagons had been found. When the last one was set, the pattern was undeniable. Every wagon lay within a short radius of the Broussard property. Every trail of disappearance seemed to bend toward their land. The room fell silent. The priest crossed himself. The sheriff exhaled slowly, his jaw set. What they had feared in whispers now stood before them in hard evidence. Sheriff Gaspard closed his notebook and said, the words that would set everything in motion. "It's time to see what the Broussards are hiding." Within days, he gathered 8 deputies, 4 hounds trained for tracking, and a small stock of supplies. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would approach at dawn, circle the property quietly, and search for proof before the family could scatter. What they did not yet know was that they were not preparing to to uncover a crime of passion or a single gruesome act. They were about to step into the remnants of a machine, a system of killing and butchering refined over years. The raid began in the gray stillness before dawn. Sheriff Harlan Gaspard and his deputies moved like shadows through the swamp, their boots sinking into the mud, dogs straining against leashes as they caught scents carried on the damp morning air. The Broussard homestead lay just ahead, hidden behind walls of cypress and moss. For years it had been the subject of rumor and suspicion. Today, it would finally be laid bare. From a distance, the property looked quiet. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no voices carried through the trees. But as the lawmen drew closer, they noticed signs of recent activity. Tools left against a wall, wet laundry strung across a sagging line, footprints pressed deep in the mud, as though a large group had moved hurriedly. Sheriff Gaspard positioned his men in a circle, tightening around the cabins. Then he gave the signal. With dogs barking furiously, they stormed the property. What they found inside was worse than anything they had prepared themselves for. The first shed they entered was nothing short of a slaughterhouse. Rough-hewn tables stood stained dark with old blood. Iron hooks dangled from beams, swaying gently as though waiting for new weight. Saws, cleavers, and knives of all sizes lay scattered across workbenches, their edges dulled from constant use. The floorboards themselves bore grooves channels carved by years of fluid draining away. The air reeked of rust, rot, and something sweetly nauseating that clung to clothes and skin. In the second shed, the horror became systematic. Rows of wooden barrels filled the room, each packed with salted flesh. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with strips of drying meat and racks of smoked cuts. To the untrained eye, it might have passed for a hunter's storehouse. But Dr. Renaud, who had accompanied the deputies, knelt to examine the cuts. His face went pale. These were not deer or boar. The uniformity, the precision of the cuts, the very texture of the flesh, it was human. The third shed revealed the scale of the operation. Here, everything was arranged like a commercial warehouse. Improvised shelves held bundles wrapped in cloth, each tagged with scribbled notes in archaic French. Translated, the words revealed categories no one wanted to read aloud. Adulte homme, firm; adult male, firm; enfant, tendre; child, tender; fille douce, girl soft. The family had built a catalog of their victims, labeling, storing, and rotating their grisly stock with chilling efficiency. Behind the compound lay the final evidence. Deputies, led by the hounds, discovered a series of shallow pits dug into the soft swamp soil. At first, it looked like the remains of animal carcasses, bones piled together in a crude attempt at disposal. But as the men dug deeper, the truth emerged. Human bones, dozens of them, some small enough to belong to children, others bearing deep, deliberate cut marks. The bones had been mixed with those of hogs and deer, as though to camouflage their true number. Dr. Renaud examined several on the spot, his voice breaking as he confirmed they bore the marks of professional butchery. Flesh had been stripped clean, marrow split open for extraction. This was not chaos. It was craft. The deputies gagged, some turning away, others muttering prayers. Sheriff Gaspard, though hardened by years of violent crime, admitted later in his report that his stomach churned and his hands shook. He had expected to find evidence of a few murders, perhaps some twisted ritual. Instead, he had uncovered an industrial system, an assembly line of death and consumption. Chaos erupted as the Broussards realized the law had come. Voices rang out in the old French dialect, sharp and frantic. Figures burst from cabins and sheds, scattering in every direction. Deputies fired warning shots into the air, dogs lunged, men shouted. In the confusion, several Broussards slipped into the swamp, vanishing into the reeds with the speed of those who knew every trail and hiding place. When the smoke cleared, 7 family members had been captured: the matriarch Eulalie, her daughter Corinne, and 5 of the younger children. But the others, Augustine, Lisette, Remy, Baptiste, Sabine, and 2 of the older adolescents were gone, swallowed by the swamp that had always protected them. The deputies regrouped, shaken, dragging their prisoners into custody. Behind them lay a property no longer shrouded in rumor, but exposed in all its grotesque reality. Sheriff Gaspard would later write, "It was not the frenzy of madmen that we discovered, but the cold order of a business. Every tool had its place, every task its worker, every victim accounted for. They had not simply killed, they had built a machine." The captured Broussards were hauled back to Shreveport under heavy guard, a procession that drew stares and whispers from every road and hamlet along the way. People lined the dirt tracks to glimpse the family that rumors had turned into legends of fear. Some spat, others crossed themselves, and a few simply looked away, unable to confront the truth that neighbors, people of flesh and blood, could become something so monstrous. In the sheriff's jailhouse, makeshift interrogation rooms were prepared. Sheriff Harlan Gaspard, Father Bro, and Dr. Emile Renaud all took part in the questioning, though none of them could have anticipated the coldness of what they were about to hear. At the center of it all sat Eulalie Broussard, the 75-year-old matriarch. Frail in body but sharp in tongue, she carried herself with a superiority that unsettled everyone present. She did not weep, did not beg, and did not seem to fear her fate. Instead, she looked upon the lawmen as though they were children failing to understand a lesson. When asked about the disappearances, she leaned forward and said in a rasping voice, "Hunger is a ledger. Waste is a sign. We did only what was needed, and we did it well." Her words silenced the room. Her daughter Corinne, 38 years old, proved even more disturbing. Where Eulalie spoke in riddles of morality twisted by survival, Corinne was practical, precise, almost proud. She described the family's operation as if she were recounting household chores or the workings of a mill. She explained how the younger members scouted travelers along the roads, pretending to be lost children or friendly guides. Once a target was chosen, Augustine or Baptiste would approach offering food or directions, lulling the victims into a false sense of safety. Then, when Eulalie gave the signal, the family acted in unison, swift, silent, lethal. The victims were struck down with heavy hammers or axes, chosen not for cruelty but efficiency. Corinne made a point of stressing that death was quick, to avoid unnecessary suffering or noise. "We were not savages," she said coldly. "We were workers." Once the bodies were brought back to the homestead, the system unfolded. Adults handled the slaughter, while adolescents assisted in butchering and separating cuts. Even children had their roles, scrubbing bones, salting meat, carrying scraps. Nothing went to waste. Every part had value, Corinne explained, her voice tinged with pride. Perhaps the most chilling phrase came from Eulalie herself during one of the sessions. When pressed about the morality of killing neighbors, travelers, and even children, she shrugged and said, "Meat is meat. Family is family. Work is work." Those words would later echo in court transcripts and newspaper headlines, cementing the Broussards' place in history as more than murderers. They were an industry of death. Dr. Renaud's examinations of the 5 captured children revealed the terrible effects of generations of inbreeding and conditioning. They bore subtle deformities, crooked jaws, twisted feet, uneven teeth, but worse than their bodies were their minds. The children obeyed instantly whenever Eulalie or Corinne spoke, even in whispers. When questioned separately, they seemed confused by the sheriff's outrage. 12-year-old Odette explained matter-of-factly that their food was better than the butcher's meat in town. because they knew exactly where it came from. 8-year-old twins Sylvain and Soleni argued over which cuts they preferred, speaking as though they were discussing sweets. To them, cannibalism was not evil. It was simply life. The trial that followed in late 1905 drew national attention. Reporters from New Orleans, St. Louis, and even New York crowded into Shreveport's courthouse, hungry for details. The improvised chamber overflowed with spectators, some relatives of the vanished, others townsfolk driven by horrified curiosity. When Eulalie was led into the courtroom, she wore the same faded black dress she had been arrested in, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She walked slowly, but with her head high, her eyes cold and unflinching. When the charges were read aloud, 42 counts of murder, cannibalism, and conspiracy, she sat with the calm of a businesswoman listening to a financial report. Corinne, seated beside her, often interrupted the prosecutor, correcting him on details of butchery or preservation, as though the proceedings were a technical seminar rather than a trial for mass murder. Her arrogance unsettled even the most seasoned court officials. Witness after witness testified. The priest describing the discovery of artifacts, the sheriff recounting the raid, Dr. Renaud presenting bones marked with knife cuts. But it was the Broussards' own words that damned them most. Transcripts of their interrogations revealed a family that saw themselves not as killers, but as workers running a farm, with travelers as livestock. The verdict was never in doubt. Eulalie was sentenced to death by hanging. Corinne, spared the gallows due to her age and testimony, received life imprisonment. The 5 captured children were declared legally unfit to stand trial. Instead, they were sent to distant orphanages, where priests and teachers struggled in vain to unlearn what years of indoctrination had burned into their minds. On a cold December morning in 1905, Eulalie was led to the gallows in Shreveport. Rain slicked the boards beneath her feet, and a hush fell over the gathered crowd. Asked for last words, she gazed at the sky and rasped, "One day, others will do as we did. And you will call them clever." Moments later, the trapdoor fell, and the matriarch of America's most infamous family of cannibals swung lifeless, her prophecy hanging in the air, as heavy as her body. Corinne lived only 2 more years in prison. Guards reported she refused to eat the food provided, claiming it was unfit. She survived on bread and water until pneumonia carried her off into 1907. Even at the end, she expressed no regret, only disappointment that her work had been cut short. Even after the matriarch's hanging and Corinne's sentencing, the horror of the Broussards was far from over. The family had not been destroyed entirely. When deputies stormed the homestead, nearly half of them had slipped into the swamp, the men and older youths who knew every secret trail through reeds and cypress. Their escape ensured that the community's fear did not end with the trial. For months afterward, hunters and fishermen whispered of strange sightings. Gaunt figures were seen darting between trees at dusk. Canoes overturned in narrow channels, their owners swearing they felt eyes on them from the shadows. One lumber crew claimed to find the remains of an abandoned camp on a tiny island, a ring of ashes, gnawed bones scattered around, and crude carvings etched into tree trunks. Dr. Emile Renaud, called to examine the bones, concluded grimly that they were human. Whether the victims were outsiders who stumbled upon the fugitives or members of the family turning on each other remained uncertain. By 1906, Sheriff Gaspard organized multiple searches of the swamps, but the land itself protected the fugitives. Thick vegetation, waist-deep water, and endless twisting trails defeated even the most determined trackers. At best, they found scraps of clothing snagged on branches, or footprints that vanished into muck. Some searchers believed the escapees had perished of hunger or disease. Others swore they had simply melted deeper into the swamp, carrying on their family work where no lawman would ever reach them. The Broussard homestead did not survive long after the raid. In September 1906, a sheriff ordered it burned to the ground. What should have been a single day's fire lasted nearly 5. Years of blood, fat, and smoke had seeped into the very wood, turning the soil itself into fuel. For miles around, the air carried the stench of something more than timber burning. Locals later said the swamp itself seemed to groan as the last of the buildings collapsed into ash. Yet even fire could not erase the evidence. Each spring flood brought bones and artifacts back to the surface. Shoes, belt buckles, toys, and fragments of human skeletons washed downstream, reminders that the swamp would not keep the family's crimes buried. Farmers collecting driftwood found themselves instead clutching ribs or jawbones. Children stumbled upon half-buried dolls with rotted cloth faces. The land refused to let the horror rest. The surviving children, those spared trial and sent to orphanages, lived fractured lives. Odette grew increasingly violent, attempting to convince other orphans to eat raw meat and attacking staff when denied. The twins, Sylvain and Solène, were separated after repeated incidents. One died young in an institution. The other lived into his 20s, still muttering about family work. Only Amy, the youngest, seemed to escape the legacy. Adopted under a new name by a family in another state, she married, had children, and never spoke of her origins. Her grave marker decades later bore no hint of the name, Broussard, but the story of the family would not vanish with her silence. Newspapers carried lurid headlines across the nation: Cannibal Clan of Louisiana and Death Farm in the Bayou. For decades afterward, travelers refused to use the roads near the old property. Superstition grew that the ground itself was cursed, that the cries of the murdered could still be heard on stormy nights. Even hunters avoided the region, claiming the swamp carried an unnatural stillness, as if watching them. Father Bro, who had uncovered the first artifacts, never truly recovered. He requested a transfer out of the parish in 1907, writing in his final journal entry, "What I have seen was not the work of demons, but of men." That truth weighs heavier than any possession of the devil. Sheriff Gaspard continued his service for years, but admitted in later interviews that the Broussard case had changed him forever. "I saw," he said, "what people can do when they stop seeing each other as human." In the end, the Broussard's tale is not remembered because it was supernatural or because of myths of swamp spirits. It endures because it was chillingly human. No curses, no dark magic, just isolation, inbreeding, hunger, and the cold efficiency of people who convinced themselves that survival meant turning their neighbors into stock. True horror of the Broussards is not that they were unique. It's the possibility that under the right conditions cut off from the world, bound by blood, and desperate for survival, any family might descend into the same abyss. Civilization is a thin veil. When it tears, what emerges can be far worse than monsters of folklore. If this story unsettled you as much as it did me, then subscribe now. Because the Broussards are only one chapter in America's forgotten horrors, and there are many more waiting in the dark.